In October 1962, the world held its breath. For 13 incredibly tense days, humanity found itself staring into the abyss of nuclear annihilation. This period, known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, was the closest the Cold War ever came to becoming a full-scale nuclear war. It was a confrontation not of armies clashing on a battlefield, but of nerves, strategy, and the terrifying possibility of mutual destruction. The crisis began silently, with high-altitude photographs revealing a secret that would shake the globe. On the island of Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida, the Soviet Union was secretly installing nuclear missiles, weapons capable of striking major American cities with very little warning. The discovery of these missile sites triggered a chain of events that brought two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, to the very edge of a catastrophic conflict. The roots of this crisis ran deep into the Cold War, the long ideological struggle between the democratic United States and the communist Soviet Union. After World War II, these two former allies became rivals, each seeking to expand its influence and contain the others. The United States had its own nuclear missiles stationed in Turkey and Italy, countries that bordered the Soviet Union. This was a direct threat to Moscow, and the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev felt his country was at a strategic disadvantage. He saw an opportunity to level the playing field by placing similar weapons right in America's backyard. The move was also intended to protect Cuba, a new communist ally in the Western Hemisphere, from another potential U.S. invasion like the failed Bay of Pigs operation in 1961. Cuba, a small island nation, had undergone a revolution in 1959, bringing the charismatic and defiant Fidel Castro to power. Castro aligned his new government with the Soviet Union, creating a communist outpost just a short distance from American shores. For the United States, this was an unacceptable development, a breach of its long-standing dominance in the region. The discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba was therefore not just a military threat, but a profound political challenge. It represented a bold and dangerous move by the Soviets, a test of American resolve. The stage was set for a high-stakes showdown, a geopolitical chess match where a single wrong move could lead to unimaginable devastation for the entire planet. The news of the missiles was kept secret from the public for several days as President John F. Kennedy and his advisors scrambled to formulate a response. The options they considered were fraught with danger. A direct airstrike on the missile sites could kill Soviet personnel, potentially triggering an immediate military retaliation from Moscow. An invasion of Cuba would likely lead to a protracted and bloody conflict. Doing nothing, however, was seen as a sign of weakness that would embolden the Soviets and damage American credibility worldwide. The world was unknowingly drifting closer to a precipice, as a small group of leaders in Washington, D.C. weighed decisions that would determine the fate of millions of people who were completely unaware of the looming danger. At the center of this dangerous drama were three leaders, each holding immense power and facing incredible pressure. In the White House, the young and relatively inexperienced President John F. Kennedy was tested as never before. He had to project strength to the world and to his political opponents at home, while also seeking a peaceful resolution to avoid a nuclear holocaust. Kennedy assembled a team of his most trusted advisors, known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM, to debate the path forward. He was determined to get the Soviet missiles out of Cuba, but was acutely aware that any aggressive action could spiral out of control, leading to a war that no one could win. His leadership required a delicate balance of firmness and restraint. In the Kremlin, the Soviet premier Nikita Khrushchev was a wily and often unpredictable leader. He was a veteran of the brutal power struggles of the Soviet system, known for both his folksy charm and his explosive temper. Khrushchev had initiated the risky gambit of placing missiles in Cuba for multiple reasons. Media group, Soviet missiles being transported, Soviet military parade displaying missiles, Khrushchev with missile diagrams added stock added distribute underscore equally, to protect Castro's revolution, to counter the American missiles in Turkey, and to score a major strategic victory in the Cold War. He believed he could install the weapons before the Americans noticed, presenting them with a fait accompli. However, he had misjudged the American reaction and now found himself in a rapidly escalating crisis that threatened to escape his control, forcing him to match Kennedy's every move. The third key figure was Fidel Castro, the revolutionary leader of Cuba. Having recently overthrown a US-backed dictator, Castro was fiercely protective of his nation's sovereignty and deeply suspicious of American intentions, especially after the Bay of Pigs invasion. He welcomed the Soviet missiles as a necessary deterrent to prevent another American attack on his island. Throughout the crisis, Castro was arguably the most militant of the three leaders, urging the Soviets to stand firm against American pressure. He was prepared to see his country become a battlefield in the global struggle between communism and capitalism, believing that the defense of the revolution was worth any cost, even the risk of nuclear war. These three men, Kennedy, Khrushchev, and Castro, formed a volatile triangle of power. Their decisions were shaped by their personal histories, their political ideologies, and the immense weight of national expectations. Kennedy was haunted by the failure of the Bay of Pigs, and needed to appear strong. Khrushchev was under pressure from hardliners in his own government who saw any compromise as a sign of weakness. Castro was driven by a revolutionary zeal and a genuine fear for his country's survival. The fate of the world rested on the interactions between these three individuals, each navigating a treacherous landscape of threats, bluffs, and secret negotiations, with the specter of nuclear war looming over every choice they made. The crisis unfolded over 13 days, from October 16 to October 28, 1962, a period of unparalleled global tension. After confirming the existence of the missile sites, President Kennedy and his ex-com advisors debated their options in secret. On October 22, Kennedy addressed the American people and the world in a televised speech. He revealed the presence of the Soviet missiles in Cuba and announced his decision, not an immediate invasion, but a naval quarantine around the island. This was a carefully chosen word. A blockade is technically an act of war. The quarantine was intended to prevent any more offensive military equipment from reaching Cuba, giving the Soviets time to reconsider their actions while demonstrating American resolve. The announcement of the quarantine immediately escalated the situation. The US military was placed on high alert at DEFCON 3, and preparations were made for a possible invasion of Cuba. Around the world, people watched in fear as Soviet ships carrying military supplies steamed toward the quarantine line. The critical question was whether these ships would stop or attempt to run the blockade, an act that would almost certainly lead to a military confrontation. This was the moment of maximum danger, a global standoff on the high seas. In schools, children practiced duck and cover drills, and families anxiously built fallout shelters, believing that nuclear war was not just possible, but imminent. The tension reached its peak on Saturday, October 27th, a day that would become known as Black Saturday. Several events occurred that nearly pushed the crisis over the edge. An American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missile, killing the pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson. This was a major escalation, and Kennedy's military advisors strongly urged him to retaliate with an airstrike against the missile sites. On the same day, another U-2 plane accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia, prompting the Soviets to scramble fighter jets to intercept it. It felt as if events were spiraling out of control, driven by accident and miscalculation toward an inevitable conflict. Behind the scenes, however, a frantic and secret channel of communication had opened between Washington and Moscow. Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged a series of letters and back-channel messages, probing for a way out of the crisis. Kennedy's brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, met secretly with the Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin. In these tense negotiations, the outlines of a deal began to emerge. The Soviets were looking for a way to withdraw the missiles without appearing to have been defeated, while the Americans were desperate to find a peaceful solution. The world watched and waited, completely unaware of the secret diplomacy that was the last best hope for preventing a nuclear catastrophe. The breakthrough came from the very brink of disaster. Facing immense pressure and the horrifying reality of what a nuclear exchange would mean, both Kennedy and Khrushchev chose diplomacy over confrontation. On the morning of Sunday, October 28, Moscow radio broadcast a message from Premier Khrushchev. He announced that the Soviet Union had decided to dismantle the missile sites in Cuba and return the weapons to the USSR. In return, the United States publicly pledged not to invade Cuba. The immediate crisis was over. The Soviet ships heading for the quarantine line turned back, and across the globe, a collective sigh of relief was heard. the world had stepped back from the abyss. What the public did not know at the time was that there was a second, secret part of the agreement. During his clandestine meeting with Ambassador Dobrynin, Robert F. Kennedy had conveyed a crucial offer. He promised that if the Soviet missiles were removed from Cuba, the United States would, after a short interval, quietly remove its own Jupiter nuclear missiles from Turkey. This was a significant concession, as it addressed the very security concern that had prompted Khrushchev to send missiles to Cuba in the first place. This secret deal allowed Khrushchev to save face at home, presenting the outcome as a reasonable compromise rather than a humiliating retreat, which was essential for securing his agreement. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis had a profound and lasting impact on the Cold War. The terrifying experience of being so close to nuclear war sobered the leaders in both Washington and Moscow. It led to a recognition that they needed better ways to manage their rivalry and prevent future crises from escalating to such a dangerous level. In the aftermath, a direct telephone link, the so-called hotline, was established between the White House and the Kremlin to allow for instant communication during a crisis. The two superpowers also took the first steps toward controlling the nuclear arms race, signing the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which prohibited nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. The lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis remain critically important today. It stands as a powerful reminder of how quickly international disputes can escalate, and how easily miscalculation and miscommunication can lead to catastrophe. The crisis highlighted the immense responsibility of leaders who possess nuclear weapons and the necessity of clear communication, empathy, and a willingness to compromise, even with one's staunchest adversaries. In a world where nuclear weapons still exist, the 13 days in October 1962 serve as a stark and enduring warning. It teaches us that the pursuit of peace requires courage, and that survival itself can depend on the wisdom to step back from the brink.